Hello, my name is Christine Perret. Welcome to this WorkinAR session hosted by the area and myself. I am very pleased to host this session. It's one in a series of modules or sessions that we've been organizing with an emphasis on very practical information that people can acquire with the help of the area. I've had previous WorkinAR sessions about use case selection, about estimating return on investment, and some other topics. And I certainly encourage you, if you have not done so already, to check out the area.org website for the different essential WorkinAR series, I think, like that, something along those lines. So today's WorkinAR session focuses on interoperability and standards, and it's going to be at the beginning more generally about standards, and then we'll drill down more focused on interoperability for augmented reality and the AR standards that are there. So the attendees are in listen-only mode, and you will be hearing from the guests and experts that have agreed to participate in this session. They'll be introducing themselves in just a minute. And then we'll have some these topics will be discussed about the terms and the goals, challenges, and approaches to interoperability. And I'll be giving a presentation about different communities and standards. And finally, we'll wrap up with, again, emphasis on practical information that we can share with you about using interoperable AR components, how to build them, choose them, and use them. So before we go in any further, I'd like to welcome the experts that are here with us today. Neil, would you please introduce yourself so we can hear your voice?
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Neil Trevitt. My day job is at NVIDIA, where I work on developer ecosystems. I'm also president of the Kronos Group, which is a standards organization. And we've been involved in initiating a number of the Kronos standards there that are relevant to AR. And actually, AR has been for a long time at Kronos being one of our motivating use cases because it tends to need and use almost all of the standards that we work on. So very happy to be here.
Thank you. Dan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Dan McPeters. I'm lead researcher and of advanced technologies and engineer at Newport News Shipbuilding. We are the only producer of the U.S. Navy's nuclear aircraft carrier fleet, and we propose solutions with AR and other technologies to aid the shipbuilder and eventually the Navy sailor. We've been doing augmented reality related functions since 2011, and happy to be here today.
Thank you. Scott?
Yeah, hey, welcome everyone, and really pleased to be here, Christine. Thanks for organizing this. My name is Scott Simmons. I'm the Chief Standards Officer with the Open Geospatial Consortium, and our focus at the OGC, as we're better known, is making data, location data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And where that's really important with today's webinar is when you're augmenting reality and that reality is located someplace on the Earth or perhaps even another planet, the absolute necessity of knowing exactly where you are and what's around you is really, really important.
Great, thank you, gentlemen. And as I said, you'll be unmuted and interactive. The goals of today are to increase the knowledge that people have about interoperability, specifically with industrial augmented reality. So while some of the principles we're sharing are applicable to any field, and they are appropriate to augmented reality in consumer and education settings as well, our focus really is on the industrial AR use cases. We want to give those of you who are engineers, developers, architects and decision makers some skills and some knowledge that you can use to build a strategy and then to implement it. And then hopefully after this session, you'll also have a sense that you too could be involved in the development of standards or open source libraries or code to advance the interoperability. And the area has some policies and programs in place to help that, but we would like everyone, regardless of whether they are members of the area or not, to participate in this important process. So I wanted to emphasize with this slide, and it is so much to the heart of the area, we want to accelerate the growth of an ecosystem of augmented reality users and providers. And I believe that standards can help support an ecosystem that's fairly complex. It has lots of different moving parts. And while it seems kind of maybe not intuitive to put the integrator or the developer in the middle of this picture, I want to explain that in some cases, these integrators and developers are the glue, and they're really providing the skills and the knowledge to help customers and the buyers of technologies choose which products and services they need. And when they work within a customer organization, they're also helping end users to get more value out of augmented reality. So those integrators and developers may be external, they may be for hire, they may work for providers, they may be the partners of providers, or they may be working internally in a customer organization. But those folks in the middle, they've got to know what the requirements of the customer are, and also understand the competitive advantages of different solutions. And sometimes those competitive advantages come down to, are they interoperable? So that's my 2 cents on this particular slide. Now I'd like to ask Neil to tell us a little bit more about what you have in mind with this slide.
Yeah, this is a slide we put together at Kronos to trying to get across the idea that standards are a vital tool if you want to build products and ecosystems out to pervasive scale available to everyone. And one of the examples there in the middle is the PC. Many of us are using PCs every day, and many of us are using PCs to build AR systems. And of course, a PC is built from a web of literally hundreds of hardware and software standards. They're so commonly used that very often we take them for granted. But if you stop and think, if we had to create our own platform from scratch, if every company was building the equivalent of a PC without standards, we would never make forward progress as an industry. And the other example we put here, even the simple act of plugging your PC into the wall, that's the result of another whole standardization ecosystem that was created 100 years ago. It's become so ubiquitous that again we just take it for granted. And if we're going to be successful with AR, making AR as ubiquitous as that we want, if we're successful, we're going to have the standards in place. Probably thousands of standards in place to make something like AR come to reality. And if we're successful, people will take those standards for granted. A standard becomes pretty successful when people do just assume it's there and don't think about it anymore. It's fulfilling its function.
I love the title of this slide because I've heard this joke, and people say, there's so many standards to choose from, and people roll their eyes when they say that. They're really cognizant that there are so many standards. And look over on the left-hand side of the slide. There's so many numbers. You know, why standards always have numbers associated with them. But anyway, it's confusing, and it's a big headache if you are trying to achieve the goals of your company.
Yeah, most of the time, though, there's a good reason to have that constellation of lots and lots of standards, because each well-designed standard is fulfilling a very specific purpose. So
that's really a great segue, Neil, to asking Scott. This is a slide that Scott put together from showing the OGC perspective about how standards are helping people with geospatial data.
And the point of so many standards is really highly relevant. There can never be the one standard to rule them all. We just don't have that luxury in life. And in fact, in the ideal situation, your standards are granular enough to allow people to do just what they need with the content they have or the function they need to serve. And so what's illustrated on the right is really how, in a geospatial sense, when you're looking at map content or the content that describes the world around you, you can make that information available in discrete layers. And each layer may have its own rules for how it's collected and put together and verified. But ideally, if all the right standards are in place, each one of those adheres to some common rules, and they all line up nicely and neatly, and so everything builds together to give you a full picture of the Earth. And you need those standards so that your users have some expectation of how the information will behave. You know, a query against a street address should return you a spot on the Earth. If you want to turn off the buildings in one of those layers, you ought to see the trees behind it. And so the manner in which these standards interoperate is almost, in fact, probably every bit as important as having the standards themselves.
Great point.
Yeah, and this is just the terrifying slide to get people to think about that the world's not as simple as you think. And another role we have in the standards community is to obfuscate or obscure as much of this as we can from the end developer and user. You don't really need to worry as an end user when you're experiencing an augmented reality environment, the subtleties of the fact that the Earth's plates are moving around, and just the amazing fact that in 36 minutes, Japan moved closer to Los Angeles by up to 5 meters in a single day due to an earthquake. All of that information, how all that works, is hidden under the hood, and ideally you as a consumer don't ever have to worry about that problem, and even you as a software developer will have the standards to, again, make that part easy for you, so you just work about what's important. I need to show you something in Sendai, Japan. It's going to be in the right place because you're using the right standards.
That's a great point. You used a key word which we all use often, which is abstraction, layers of abstractions to hide complexity. That's really a fundamental benefit for some standards, not all, but some standards. I want to, because some of the questions in this webinar, some things that we're going to be asking our attendees to understand is, or to tell us about, I want to explain what I think interoperability is in the context of augmented reality. And it is written here on this screen, and really I just want to emphasize the bold parts. We know that there's so many different, AR comes in a lot of different packages. Sometimes it's a completely integrated system. Sometimes it's a set of disparate components. And there's also, of course, always software and content. There's exchange of data that has to happen. And we want to just deliver that experience regardless of what system the user has, whether it's a different provider of a service or a product, without having to lose anything along the way. We don't want to have lossy translation. We don't want to have errors in converting the data or delays that might be involved when that data is manipulated between systems. So to me, this is the core of doesn't talk about the business benefits. It's just, what does interoperability mean? And I've got a few pictures. So all these little icons in the left-hand side are the different components that one could imagine needing in an AR system. Let's assume for the moment that it's a multi-vendor environment that you're in an enterprise IT environment. You have multiple different kinds of AR displays. Of course, a lot of tablets these days, but certainly other display systems are going to be part of the mix. You don't need to know when a user walks up to a projection system, all of the intricacies on the left-hand side. What they just need to know is that the data has been integrated with the existing enterprise IT systems so that it's secure, so that it's accurate, it's contextual, it's fresh, and so forth. And really what interoperability means is that the data is in the control of the right people, it's delivered at the right time, and that it has the value people are seeking without compromise or risk. So to me, this is a few slides just to define what is interoperability in the context of enterprise AR. Now, back to the high level, the conversation we were having before about open standards in general, they do certainly bring us some benefits. They help us to grow the market because the customer can say with some confidence that they are getting the value, getting the features that they think they're getting, that customers more comfortable purchasing augmented reality products and services, and that the providers of technologies on the left-hand side can move ahead with their new products, their new functionality with less friction, because they have some confidence that the components they purchase will work together, play nicely, as Scott said, and that there will be some concrete, very specific ways that they can test and establish that interoperability. Having said that, faster time to market, lower confusion from the point of view of the customer buyer, means that the customer can be confident that when they purchase a new product or they're getting a new system into their IT, they're not going to have to re-engineer everything. They can assemble a unique solution without having to rewrite all the code. And the providers of technologies, so systems integrators, as well as the providers that are internally to the customer organizations, can assemble and make new value propositions and be competitive based on their implementations. All of these things together are reducing the costs for both the providers as well as the customers and the end users. So reducing costs, of course, is a very, very powerful benefit. But I don't want to ignore the fact that there's also reduced risk. So this is all part of the same equation. I'm going to pause here and ask, do my panelists have anything you want to add about these goals for standardization?
Yeah, I'll add in here that this is really laid out well. As somebody who's that integrator sometimes in the middle, I don't want to have to worry about all the small minutia involved in touching points with our end users and our business leaders, and then all the hardware and everything that's going on. So standards is really important on a personal level, and like you just pointed out, when we're putting out a product every 7 years, so the price put into per product is very high, and the amount of security, of course, that's entailed restricts us in our ability to flip, flop, and change. We want to get away from churning for no reason. So bringing standards to maturity is already showing benefits for portability and ways that we can make a quick switch from VR to AR or vice versa and not rewrite the entire source. So I really like how this is laid out because this is exactly how it feels a lot of times.
One of the things I wanted to do, and I want to thank Neil somewhat for the inspiration of this slide, because we're often accused, people who work on standards, of fear mongering. You know, if you don't do this, it's going to be terrible. You can't adopt AR with this, and that's really not necessary. I think we can really we can show, and later on in the talk we should give examples for how we've accelerated time to market or enabled more innovation, and there I'm sure the panelists will have examples. But we've been talking somewhat without defining all our terms, so I want to ask Neil to share with us what is the definition of an open standard, and why is what is an interoperability standard specifically?
Yeah, so in this context, when we say standards, we normally pretty much mean interoperability standards, and that means it's boiling down to enabling precise communication. Now, it can be communication in a number of ways. It can be between people, between systems. Now, an example which is near and dear to Kronos' heart is an API, but that's basically just enabling a software package to communicate with a hardware device. It boils down to well-defined communication in the end. And there are a number of interesting kind of ways that happens in practice. Now, a well-formed standard will just focus on the communication. How are these two things going to communicate? A well-formed standard won't overprescribe implementation details. That unleashes the power of competition and innovation. So standardization does not mean a race to a lowest common denominator. It's just removing that communication friction point. And truly open, we often use the phrase open standards. To me, open means it's not controlled by a single company. And that means you need industry cooperation to have multiple companies creating them and evolving them. And that's why we have what we call these standards developing organizations, or SDOs if you want to get geeky. They are organizations, typically non-profit, to enable multiple companies to work together to build these consensus-based open standards to move the industry forward. And effective SDOs have well-defined governance models, so companies understand how they're working together. And one of the most vital pieces of that is the intellectual property framework. So people know that their IP is protected and the standard is protected in the market. And as you were saying, for each of these organizations typically has a specific area of expertise. And so, as Scott was saying, it's not only important that the different standards work well together. No, it's actually important that different standards organizations work well together. Mm-hmm. We don't want to duplicate work. Life's too short. And we want to make sure that the work that we're doing in our specific domains works well with the other folks working in other domains that we need to interoperate to. So it's really a web of cooperation throughout the industry.
Perfect. Thanks, Neil. I think this is really important. I want to also help emphasize something that you'd prepared before about the connection between proprietary products, that as the technology becomes proven and people find those areas of consensus. So it's important that the standardization process happen at just this optimum time, quote unquote, when the opportunities are there for people to say, we really do need to smooth out this area, this specific area, and then they can work on those standards together. And it's this complex relationship between the proprietary and the open standards. Neither one is designed to exist without the other. In fact, they're supposed to be complementary, and there's a lot of examples of that.
Yeah, they need each other.
Exactly.
Either wouldn't exist without the other. You don't typically want to do cutting edge R&D in a committee. We've learned at Kronos.
We've tried that.
Yeah, we tried that. Don't do that.
It doesn't work.
But if you have a well-proven technology and you want to scale it out to to be ubiquitous in the industry, you really need an open standard. It's the only way to make it available like that.
Yeah. So I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the participants of our workshop if you think that the people in your IT organization or people who are running your strategy, do they understand interoperability? How much do they know about interoperability and standards? So the choices should be a poll that has appeared on your screen. I hope it has. So please go ahead and start to enter your answers, and we'll discuss this as soon as we see those numbers coming in. I'm seeing it's very interesting. Thanks, everybody. We've got about 40% of people have voted. So now half of you have voted. So if you haven't yet selected one of these, please go ahead and let us know if you think that people are, where is that IT organization that you're working with? Where are they on this scale? Okay, we've had it about open for about a minute. So I'm gonna go ahead and close the poll. And I'm not sure how, I click on this thing called share results. So I think you can see at this time, the more of you say that your IT and AR strategy organizations are somewhat interested and would like to embrace it. They don't have to work too hard at it. And looks like then about a same number of people are highly sensitive, and some are just barely aware. Any comments on this, gentlemen? Does this come as a surprise to you, or is this about in line with what you expect?
I'd have to say it's ever so slightly surprisingly good that there's attendees with already this much work going on, because a lot of time, it can be a quite challenging area for implementation at a corporate level. This can, and there are certainly plenty of people who probably look at this as being more hobby than reality, and so it's good to see this corporate level interest.
Good.
Yeah, I was going to say that was better than I was hoping for. The fact that the majority of folks are either aware or interested or already understand is great. Yep.
Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble getting myself back as the presenter. So I'm wondering, how am I going to share my screen again? Sharing. Okay, I'm here. I've done it. Okay, great. Mark, was that you that did that, or is that just me?
It was me, yeah. You just need to, I can't remember what it says, but yeah, there's a little button that says close or hide or something. So. Okay,
all right, thank you. So Neil, here's another big topic that we often get to is, what's the difference between open standards and open source? Can you talk to the top, or if you want me, I'll advance to the next.
Yeah, if you can do the build, I think the build will be helpful. Yeah, and one more. So, but yes, this is I often hear the terms open standards and open source getting confused in the industry, and both are good and both are necessary. Again, it's like different standards and different standards bodies. We need this diversity, but it's important to understand the differences so you can use the right tool for the right job. And the key difference is a true open standard will typically include a specification together with some type of conformance testing, so you know you've implemented the specification correctly. And that enables multiple conformant implementations throughout the industry. And that's compared to open source, where people don't need multiple implementations throughout the industry of some specification. they want to cooperate over typically building a single implementation. And there are many organizations that are set up to enable that. And if you have an open standard, it enables competition between different implementers. And I work for NVIDIA, so the classic example I always use: if you have multiple GPU vendors, the consumer gets the choice of what graphics board they plug into their PC, and that's a good thing. Whereas open source, if there's a single piece of software that the whole industry needs to use once, then you can save a lot of time and effort by sharing that implementation load between the companies. But open source will typically move faster because you don't have to build consensus, but that can be both the plus and the minus. Many cases, open source can move so quickly that it sometimes breaks compatibility. So you have to be careful. And some open source projects aren't under multi-company governance. Some are, but many aren't. Even if it's in open source, there may be one company behind the scenes that gets to decide what pull requests get accepted. And it's not a criticism, but you really need to understand the governance model of open source before you would invest in it at your company, to make sure you're not going to be left high and dry.
Exactly. I think those are really great points. Does anybody, Scott or Dan, have any comments about these differences?
Yeah, Neil highlighted it superbly, and Neil, I love this slide. It's one I want to steal myself and use.
Yeah.
Really.
So I said, bingo, this one's going in.
Yeah, describe the issue, and there are natural places where open source works really well, and particularly in conjunction with open standards, and such as fundamental libraries, for instance. It might do some things that everyone in the community could share, and it saves time, and nobody needs to write those very fundamental libraries upon which they can then build their competitive secret sauce as necessary. And then there are other places. So in OGC, we make our compliance testing tools open source so that everyone can at least have an equal basis to assess compatibility with open standards. And so there are great places where they can be collaborative, but it is also important to understand governance in both cases and ensure that you're getting what you need and that the openness is to the degree that satisfies your end needs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is a very educational slide. I learned a sharper line between the two just by looking at this slide earlier. And this also comes into decision making for us deciding how we're going to meet security standards. In how with open standard we can draw a line in the sand a little bit more cleanly and then implement in however way we need to in different areas.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, everybody. I think there's another, this is another one of those confusing things about standards development organizations, is they do all have their own governance and their own IPR policies, structures, or frameworks. And so when you go in, you say, well, why is it that some SDOs allow anybody, it seems, to contribute? There's just no barrier. Is that as valid or as accurate or as good a system as perhaps doing projects in the open? I call that. That's where non-members of the organization are allowed to observe. They can peek in and look at what's going on. They can even comment in some cases using a platform like GitHub in the process and participate, although their contributions aren't made, they aren't made directly. They have to convince someone who is in a leadership role or who's a member. And then as we go towards the left, there are standards development organizations that have a structure that permits invited experts to participate. And then those experts would be the only ones that would be non-members. And then finally, to the far left, a very highly controlled process in which inputs are only from members who have joined and who have made a commitment to keeping their, either to donating their IPR, but there are also some closed standards development organization where the standards process is closed and companies are allowed to put in their intellectual property. So as a customer, as one of the engineers or developers or the end customer who's going to be looking at standards compliance, it's important for you to know what are the regulations and what are the conditions in which this standard was developed. So I think I want to raise everybody's sensitivity to this. Comments, gentlemen, anything you want to say? Open. I know the OGC is on this spectrum.
Yeah, and we sit probably middle to middle right of the side. And what's great is we also collaborate with other SDOs. And so there's actually some natural drivers of content. So for instance, ISO is much further to the left on this diagram. And a number of OGC standards, and there's other bodies like us, eventually make their way towards ISO. And so a lot of that very more public development and open participation outside our membership gets translated into something in the very middle, where it's really focused much more on OGC members driving the final output, and then it gets pushed to an organization where it's going to be more limited, but for the very nature of the types of standards they develop. So yeah, it's an accurate spectrum.
Case by case basis, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think for successful, well-run organizations, each standard may be on a different place on the spectrum for good reasons. So I can give a couple of examples. So it's not nefarious if things get more closed necessarily, because if one of the standards we do at Kronos is the Vulkan API for graphics, GPUs. It would not be possible to open up that to anyone contributing to Vulkan and suggesting new functionality at any time, because that functionality is going to have to be delivered in a silicon roadmap that literally takes billions of dollars for each of the participants to create. So you just can't have someone that's not involved in the industry come and say no, you must do this, because everyone's roadmaps would shatter to pieces. You can take requirements and you can take requests, but in the end you have to have the chip vendors building the chips being the deciders. There's no other way to do it. But if you do more other standards, like some of the 3D formats we do, which is much more web oriented, much more open, there isn't a hardware roadmap to take care of behind the scenes, then you can be much more open, and Kronos is much more open when we do that kind of standard. But we're not completely open, because in the end we are creating a standard, not open source, right? So there has to be a deciding body. We can take lots of ideas and requirements, but in the end we have to have a specification with a well-considered roadmap. So you have to have a deciding body. To me, the litmus test though is if a standard is open, the membership of whatever body it is that's creating a standard has to be open to anybody. If
who can pay the fee? Who can pay the fee?
Even if there's a fee, and again, there's not enough typically not nefarious reasons for a fee. Keep the lights on, right? Because none of it's for free. And typically we are a non-profit, and we plow everything back into the industry.
Exactly.
So the fee is kind of it's a detail.
Point out that the area was the host of this is not an SDO, and I do want to make that abundantly clear that the structure of this organization is not set up to manage the intellectual property or the process that leads to a successful standard. However, we do want to contribute requirements, and we do want to motivate our members to get involved. So that's super important to us. And because I think at the end of the day, what you want is this process to work as a consensus process, that you have lots of different requirements coming from qualified sources to contribute to a specification. And then after that specification is released, there's different ways of distributing it. So let's have a couple of comments about that. Neither Kronos nor the OGC charge a fee for their standards. So they're both companies or SDOs that are in the for free. However, we do have cases where this exact same standard can be purchased. What's with that?
There's a part of that is, it's an operational model. And so OGC and Kronos and others have membership fees that ensure that, again, those that are participating in the process, who've invested in the process, are also paying for the management of that process or the assistance. And so it's a little bit front end loaded. So in OGC, we believe that people join our process, see the value in investing in it, and the result is an open and free standard for everyone in the world to use. And others have taken the approach that participants in volunteerism are very valuable up front, and it's the actual consumer of the standard that should cover the main cost of operations, and then puts the burden upon a for-fee standard. So I honestly probably stay away from any of the logical arguments here.
It's a business question. It's a question of strategy on the part of the SDO and history. There's a lot of history in some of these SDOs. They can't reinvent themselves.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple different ways that the implementer or end user can be asked to pay. One is just a minor niggle. The other one is fundamental. So it's important to understand the difference. So the example I think you're using, you can get an OGC or a Kronos standard for free, but once it becomes an international standard from ISO, you have to pay for the specification document. And it's typically a few $100s, and it's not a major barrier if you need to use the ISO version. But the other thing you really have to watch out for a non-free to use specification, if there's a royalty payment, because that can have significant fiscal impact.
Exactly.
If you
because you got it for free doesn't mean you can use it for free in all cases.
Yes, that's right. So, if you're shipping a significant number of seats of whatever this API standard is, and it incurs a royalty, then you need to be aware you could be on the hook for some significant fees there. And of course, it may be perfectly worth it and good value, but you need to be aware. But I think both OGC and Kronos, we're pretty committed to, as Scott put it well, front loading. The implementers pay to get it all done, and then we make it free for everyone to use. That's the way I think both organizations kind of believe the way to maximum adoption and benefit for the industry.
It's also how the W3C works.
Yep.
All right. Well,
most SDOs today, I think, tend to be royalty free. Yeah.
Yeah. But there are exceptions. Buyer beware. So just to sort of wrap up our discussion here, I want to say that we often see a roadblock because there's good standards, but they don't get adopted. And if they're not adopted, they have no benefit to anybody. So in order to support and to accelerate adoption, what we've seen SDOs do, and these two that were with us today, as many others, will allow a public review and comment period before they finalize and vote to ratify a standard. So those periods can be from a month to several months, and sometimes the comment period repeats itself if there are substantial changes. Most SDOs directly or indirectly get involved in compliance testing. They provide a suite, a software suite or a service. It may be a paying service, it may be free. Sometimes it's open source that allows the implementer to test their products against the specification. Again, most specifications are accompanied by 1 or 2 or more sample implementations, ideally 2, so that you can demonstrate the interoperability. A good standard also is accompanied by documentation, developer documentation, marketing for awareness about the benefits of it, and that there be the adopters themselves of a specification are public about that their support for a particular standard. I'd like to take this moment to ask the audience another question, another poll. So just 1 minute here while I launch this. Wondering if you could tell us how you characterize the enterprise AR industry. Is standardization something that people are aware of or and highly supportive of, or do you think there are people who are just want to ignore it or don't know what it is, and that's perfectly normal too? And I think got about 40% of you have voted. Thank you for your participation, letting us know. I'll keep this open for about another 10 seconds. Well, you know, it's really clear from what I'm seeing. I can see in the background what you're voting. That yeah, it's really clear. It's hard to imagine that this is going to change. So I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. It's been about 1 minute. I'm going to share the results on your screen. So it's interesting. Within Enterprise AR, it seems like there's some interest, but people are still a little cautious. Scott or Neil or Dan, what do you think about this?
I think the congratulations, audience. I think you're very astute.
That's where you would put it too.
Yeah, I mean, there are standards, and I think we're going to cover some of them in the next section. But a lot of them are pretty new. So you know, the purple bar, you know, it's probably pretty accurate. But that's why this kind of session is important.
Right.
Yeah, let me.
This is accurate. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is accurate at that integrator level as well. I mean, where the rubber hits the road, there is a lot of maturity happening right now, and it's exciting to see it happening as it's growing very fastly. You know, very fast in its maturity. So, but yeah, this is how I feel. So makes sense.
Good.
And just to echo Dan and Neil, and what I see here is really encouraging in that it's also emphasizing the need for development of a few best practices or other guidance documents that help people convert the landscape of known interests to the reality of implementation.
Perfectly said. Great, Scott, thank you. So let's see. So that's kind of where I'm going to start talking now. Thank you, guys. I'm going to talk about the landscape, and we've spoken about SDOs. We explained what they are, how they differ, and this is just a slide of alphabet soup. I'm not going to go through any of this. I'm just going to list for you that, you know, on the left-hand side, these are the 10 standards organizations that I personally follow closely. And there are others, but these are the ones that I definitely look to. And then in addition, I think for enterprise augmented reality, there are communities. They may not be standards organizations, and like the area, they're creating requirements or driving development, and they can also be doing test beds and best practices and so forth. So these are all relevant to us, the people in enterprise augmented reality. Now I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper, talk about some differences that have been pointed out to me, which I think are fascinating, is that there's a difference between what we call domain-specific and domain-neutral standards. So domain specific address the requirements of a specific market, like electricity or transportation or food safety or aviation. So those vertical markets, and they're incredibly important, and they're developed sometimes in the exact same way as domain neutral standards. So within domain neutral standards, there are, again, two groups, and the logos here are not sorted by the group, because some SDOs, which I've got the SDO logos here on the right-hand side, may do interoperability and other market standards like safety, ethics, accessibility. But usually there is a preference, there's a certain skill set with interoperability standards that, that is emphasized in the membership. So important when you hear about the alphabet soup and you start seeing all these different logos and numbers and so forth, to understand that in your industry, whatever it is, medical devices or construction or aviation, there are different organizations that are going to be influencing what you have to adopt. There's also the difference between these international standards organizations that we've spoken about. There are also national standards bodies, and I only chose 5. I mean, I could have gone wild on this and given you 25. But NIST is the US National Standards Organization, BSI is the British, CEN is the European, GB is the Chinese, and Japanese industry standards is the one on the far right. Again, it starts to get complicated when you start to consider that there's international and national. How do they overlap? Hopefully they overlap in very concrete and clear ways for the end customer. Within augmented reality, there's also a need for us to segment and to understand where standards cluster. This is a framework proposed by ETSI. It's actually a group specification that was published in March 2020, and I had a role in this, and I've been active in other frameworks in the development, because I think these modules, we need to understand that somewhere there are standards that are relevant to hardware and they have certain characteristics, and there are standards that pertain to data and they have different characteristics. They're about encoding and data formats, and there are standards organizations that work in all of these different segments. And over the next few months, I'm going to be arranging the alphabet soup all around this figure and delivering it in more detail. These are the next slides are about the sample of relevant standards that you may already be aware of. The Immersive Web Working Group that the W3C has been working on WebXR, and that is coming along. There's more and more modules that are being put into the GitHub specification repos, and they continue to incubate those on the right. But as it goes, they have to always be paying attention to other W3C wide policies, such as those about accessibility and privacy and so forth. So there's another organizational level above the Immersive Web Working Group. But they've been doing very, very well in the adoption level of WebXR. WebXR at the 1.0 level, it's been out there for about 1.5 years. And so there's quite a lot of adoption. And you can see these, you can go to this website and see if the browser that you're using is compliant and to what extent it's compliant. So there's a difference between in the WebXR, there's WebXR as a specification, there's also an AR module. And that specification is somewhat making some progress in the incubation repos, but we need to continue working. There's not been enough maturity to get to the candidate recommendation stage. So we haven't seen all of the capabilities that we will eventually need in the WebXR module. So there's an explainer on the web that you could go and learn more about that. There are other W3C working groups. There's this one on devices and sensors working group that could be relevant for a variety of different things. And then there's also, before I leave the W3C, there's also the Web of Things W3C working group that is focusing a lot on sensor data and the interactions between sensors and displays and moving objects. And so I've been following that quite closely as well. And I think they've got some great work in the Web of Things. We have with us today Neil, the president of the Kronos Group. And a few months ago in March, we conducted a webinar exclusively on the subject of Kronos Group standards for XR. So I don't want to go into too much detail here. They are moving forward, of course. There's been great progress in, so there's these ones that are specifically circled are most relevant, but there are others that could be relevant. And I want to just let Neil say a word or two here if you'd like, but this question of adoption is so critical. This was a slide that I think you're going to be sharing at Mobile World Congress this week, next week.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, this is a good example of that purple bar from the poll being correct. I mean, there is now a pretty widely adopted standard for reaching into HMD hardware for both AR and VR devices, both the headset and the controllers with haptics. OpenXR, provides you cross-platform access, so you can for the first time write your XR application to use these devices, and it can be portable across multiple vendors. So the dream is alive. But the purple bar was correct, because it really is just rolling out into the industry now. This is the first wave of devices. We've got pretty well all the key players on board, but in some cases, it's only been in April that these players have shipped OpenXR 1.0. But the good news is, I believe we have crossed the critical barrier threshold of adoption. So you're going to see OpenXR increasingly widely available and deployed throughout the industry.
Especially with Unity supporting OpenXR and the engine and Unity being so prevalent in augmented reality. So,
yep.
Thank you.
Yep, exactly.
And the Kronos Group is also bringing XR to the web. Yeah,
well, you mentioned, well, W3C is bringing it to the web. OpenXR is helping. And this is a good partitioning that we were mentioning earlier between the different SDOs. So W3C, their domain is building the browser stack, and so they are doing the WebXR. But WebXR has the same problem as any other piece of AR VR software, that they need to reach down into dozens of different devices, and that's where OpenXR can help at the native level. OpenXR is going to enable WebXR to run anywhere with one code base, and in fact now OpenXR is the default backend for reaching into the hardware for the WebXR group. So it's good to see the two. The cooperation, yeah, that's a great example. And I just want to remind those of you who are not working every day in these things that Kronos also does work in the to develop requirements and explore new opportunities. So many years ago, we identified this, but luckily the industry has come to this realization that there is a need for embedded camera APIs. And so for several months, since the month of March, mid-March, Neil has been chairing the embedded camera, and I think we can just drop the word embedded because it's becoming clear in those discussions that it's really about camera APIs. This exploratory group is a collaboration between the EMVA and Kronos, and these weekly calls are really productive, and I think we're going to have at least one new activity come out of this. Neil, what's your thinking on that? Yeah, it's become a real pain point. Integrating the cost and effort to integrate new cameras, camera modules, has become a significant friction point in the industry. But this exploratory group process, we've used it several times in Kronos now, and we don't dive right into designing an API because it's possible to make false starts. You can put some effort into a design exercise and then find there's no adoption. So we do this exploratory group where we don't produce, we come together, and there's no fee. If anyone in the audience is interested, you'll be very welcome. Anyone can join at no cost. But the output of this phase is not an API design, it's a scope of work document. So if we can generate the consensus on what we should do in the industry to solve the industry, this specific industry problem, then that's a great starting point for actually initiating the work.
Great.
And we have 70 companies have joined this group, much to our pleasant surprise.
Great, great, thank you. I'm going to probably ask Scott to chime in here and there as well. As you can see from this screen, I didn't do as good a job with the graphics in summarizing all of the different OGC standards that are relevant. I think that's something we should do, Scott. Should work on that more. The OGC has many, many activities that are so highly relevant, and I typically only feature these 3 on the left when I do my standards updates. I do standards updates for the area about 3 times a year. I chair the GeoPose Standards Working Group, and I'm pleased to say that the draft standard is it's out in the open. It's one of those working in the open specifications, and we'll have it, we'll call for public review in the next couple of months. There was a screen movie, so this is part of the supporting the ecosystem and understanding what is the purpose of GeoPose and how is it used. And we have an excellent visual glossary, because the work of the GeoPose is rendered even more complicated by the fact that there are fundamental concepts in 3D graphics and in earth sciences that come together in GeoPose, and it's really, really pretty serious stuff. So we are developing a reviewer's guide and a user's guide, so those will be published with the specification. A year ago, Scott, Apple submitted the indoor mapping data format that they had been working on, and earlier this year it was published as a community standard. Do you know anybody else that's adopted this so far?
There's quite a big community and growing community of IMDF expertise now. It was really a pleasure to have Apple submit this and trust that we could do a good job with the process. And for those of you not familiar, an OGC community standard is it's a snapshot, if you will, of a specification or standard that was developed outside OGC, but that our members think is so important and fundamental it should be part of our baseline. And so we've endorsed IMDF as a great means to deal with indoor location and data. But this community is growing rapidly, partly because IMDF is so easy to use, and in part because it is nicely aligned with a number of other standards or specifications working with indoor spaces. And so now the next task in OGC is for us to ensure that the various other things we do that deal with indoor converge to as much as a degree as possible for compatibility.
And is GeoJSON an OGC standard?
It is not. GeoJSON is published by IETF. It's a super useful standard that does exactly what it needs to do, but I'll note that OGC is now working on a new standard that is something of a larger scope, a wrapper, if you will, for GeoJSON. So for some things that GeoJSON cannot do, you would be able to add some extra functionality from the OGC standard.
Sorry about that. I muted myself because there's a thunderstorm right around me. Thank you, Scott. Points of interest. This is another topic that near and dear to my heart, so I'm co-chairing this new, well, it's an old standard working group that dates back quite a long time ago, and collaboration again between the W3C and the OGC. The work began in the W3C in 2011, but moved over into the OGC and then sort of petered out. Activity, again, I think it was a question of being too early. There was not a sufficient set of requirements, clear requirements, and demand from the industry. And I think that time, where the time is now very ripe for a points of interest specification. And that's what we started working on, and we have regular meetings. Scott, you're excited about this. I've heard you speak about it before.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, what's the POI effort is an excellent example of the benefit of standards to improve competitiveness, and that the whole point of interest development community, those that develop points of interest data, completely differentiate themselves based on the quality of their data, not the format in which it's presented or the rapid nature of exchanging content. We'll take care of all that stuff and let that community really focus on differentiating themselves on content quality. So
exactly. Yeah, it's fascinating. Effort. It is a great time to be at this, working on this. Okay, just to wrap up then, the British Standard Institute, BSI, has rolled up about a year ago a new working group, IST31, to focus on health, safety, security of AR and VR systems. They did establish a mirror working group in the subcommittee 24 and focusing on cleanliness requirements. And there's a separate one on health and safety. I mentioned earlier today the ETSI ISG AR framework. I showed you a figure of the functional architecture. That industry specification group on AR framework has just last week voted on the release of part 2 of a new specification. So this is a group specification 004 part 2 that will give the requirements for world storage, world analysis. And believe me, if you are not aware of this, this is going to be a very, very important standard for augmented reality. It's not for industry specific. It is a domain neutral and however, very profound for AR cloud features. I was the rapporteur, I still am the rapporteur for the group specification 04 part 3, which is giving the interoperability requirements for world capture, world analysis, and scene management. And we are just reviewing, on the final review and the edits of the specification to release that in a few weeks. So these are two projects, pieces of work that we've been working on for many, many months. In the case of part 2, it's over a year. Part 3, it's been about 8 or 9 months. And we are expecting to have a very active review for a public review period. Since we finished the part 2 having to do with the world storage, so this is about storage of 3D maps, metadata, what we call world understanding. We just approved the new work item to create a new open API for the creation and management of world representations. So when an AR system needs to access a world map or a local map in 3D to find its position and its orientation and or to relocalize periodically, then it will need to use a world representation that is in the world storage. It'll need to make a call to that world storage and ask for the graph and the anchors that are stored there, and receive the return response in a protocol that all systems can understand, regardless of how the world storage, that world representation was created, and who is the fundamental source or the operator of the world storage. We expect mobile network operators to have a very significant role in that in that function. Our work begins. We have an organizational meeting tomorrow, and the work will begin next week. And it is open to participation as long as you agree to the NDA and the terms of the working group. This is a very long-standing working group in Subcommittee 24 on graphics, and this working group is on the AR Continuum Concepts and Reference Model. They're just putting 3 documents to their to vote. I think that's the voting is going to be in the next ISO meeting in 30 days or so. So there's definitely going to be some interesting new things coming out of this working group and being made available for a fee. Again, ISO being one of those organizations that does sell its standards. I have mentioned this before, but I'm just going to briefly remind you that 3GPP is working on 5G and XR. That's been now 3 years since that work began. It started with this technical report 26928 that just sketched out a general XR functions in a 5G system. And for the last 6 to 8 months, been working very actively on a new document, a technical report about glasses and the needs, the different types of glasses, so wearable AR displays. And this is being done under the work item FS5G star. And I'm contributing very, very actively to this as well. The IEEE AR learning experience models published about, in April 2020, around the same time as the ETSI ISG spec. We are now doing outreach. We're doing that ecosystem development, and we are doing, there was a webinar that we did last fall on the, with the support of the area. And there is an open source implementation. It's also now available. If anybody wants to join it is a IEEE working group based on an individual basis. So just about anybody who signs the agreement can join. Our meeting is next July 7th. The IEEE also has a VR/AR working group that was established quite a few years ago, 5 years ago now. There has not been a lot of work coming out of this particular working group. However, there was a creation of a new and separate working group in 2020. About a year ago, the specification on their first specification they began working on is 2048-101. And it's interesting. It's really focusing a lot on the performance requirements and safeties to a much less extent, but really the performance, what different components of a mobile AR system should be able to meet or exceed these performance requirements. It'd be interesting to see how and where that goes. So that is my overview. We have about 15 minutes left, and I want to take us through a more conversational part of this, back again to the question of how can we convey to developers, engineers, and customers, the integrators, where should they go next? Now what? Now, if you're sold on these ideas and you would like to participate, you'd like to adopt standards, how are you going to do that? And I think in my experience, the most important segment of the ecosystem is the customer. If the customer doesn't ask for or require standards, there will be lower adoption, at least in enterprise augmented reality. It's not always the case, but so those customers need to assemble their own solutions that work in their IT environment with their challenges. And I think Dan mentioned a few minutes ago how important security. You just started to talk about security. Dan, if you want to talk a little bit more about the role of standardization and or security, the requirements that you have as a customer.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And in this current environment with recent breaches and things that have happened internationally and nationally with security, there's a heightened sensitivity, probably in everyone's organization. And I know we've felt it and are feeling it, and it's a necessary evil for us developers and integrators. It's going to increase the time to get your solution to your user. It's going to increase the amount of scanning and understanding of what the source code is, or what the end result has been packaged and compiled to be. Your cybersecurity elements are going to be more scrutinous probably, and that's what we're seeing. And so standards takes a lot of the weight off your shoulders. I mean, we started in 2011, like I said earlier, so I wouldn't say it's too early. I'm glad we started that early, but we started early enough to where a lot of the things that are standards now, we were just making up or making up solutions for. So taking that a lot of that off of our hands, and it being something that's more widely understood and used and tested is going to, and already showing to be valuable for lessening this amount of time that it takes to get your product into the hands of your users.
Right. Both at the systems integrators level, but also at the device providers level. And so many of the devices that have been available to date are not secure. There's absolutely nothing there preventing a developer from accessing and maybe having nefarious purpose. They're not locked down, and that's a real concern for companies like yours.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are very few that are close to where we want to be, and there will be more, and standards will help that out too. You know, but
do you know of security standards that you specifically would require? Or do they exist, and if so, what are they?
They exist, and I'll just generally say that you know, DISA is where we get our standards for security, and they probably get more specific than we'd like, but that's the way it has to be. They're version specific for hardware, software, so they do change, and we do move and adopt new STIGs or standards.
Okay, thank you. And then, what good is a standard how do you know if a system has worked, if it has correctly implemented a specification? Interoperability has to be tested, and compliance. Neil and Scott, can you talk about how your different organizations do certification, or how can people test if it's working?
Yeah, I can start. The Kronos puts a high priority on conformance testing. The IP framework is structured that, now, I mean, we use OpenXR as an example. Now, someone who's implementing the OpenXR standard can't call their implementation OpenXR, and they can't use the logo unless they have passed the official conformance tests that have been created by Kronos. So if you see OpenXR, you know it has been tested to the standards set by the group. I would say, we live though in the real world. Kronos puts millions of dollars into conformance testing. It's by no means a small task, but you can never get complete test coverage. It's impossible. And if you have an use case, you may be exercising different corners of the spec. Now, conformance testing does not replace application level testing. The two go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Christine, and I'll add from OGC, it's really a tiered approach. All of our standards include an abstract test suite within the standard. So it's a textual description of how you might test that specific standard. And then we offer what we refer to in our compliance program as the team engine test environment. So it's a test harness upon which you can test OGC standards. It's publicly available, open source. There's an online service for people to test as well. And so we enable anyone to test their implementation against the standard for which there is a test harness developed. But if they want to be certified, they work through a process with us where they test and we validate and verify the test results and then provide to them a stamp, as Neil indicated, a seal that shows they are certified to be compliant against the standard. But people can do that early testing in their own work environment for free as long as they need to. We do know certification becomes really important, particularly with governments, that often they need to comply with certified, tested tools. And so that's been a big
Precisely.
for us.
Oh, I wonder if the audience would share with us if they have heard or if they are providers of components and that they have used compliance with a standard as part of their value proposition. If you're providers or if you are customers, has this compliance question ever come up? People have mentioned it, or just exactly where do you see this in our industry in enterprise augmented reality today? Okay, we've got about a quarter of the people have voted, and they say they may have heard about it. It's not sure. It's not highly. It's not one of the requirements. It's not a checkbox that you see every day. And there's not been very much discussion, it looks like, so far. We've had the poll open for about 50 seconds, and about half of you have voted, which is fascinating. I'm going to share the results now. Look at that. It's half and half. Either don't recall the topic coming up, or maybe it came up. It's been mentioned. So it's like this, what we were speaking about earlier, really, gentlemen, it's early days. The standards are getting there. There's a little more education, but adoption is not something that's considered very important.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, it shows that we need to do more outreach and education on the value. And for integrators, this is an easy win, right? The hard work is creating the implementation and passing the tests. For an implementer, just to check that has happened is not a high cost item, and it can, significantly reduce integration problems. So yeah, I would encourage people to pay attention to that.
Yeah, definitely. It's like you said, we've got a lot of education ahead of us, and that's why we're here. So if we were talking to an audience solely of component providers, which HDOs might we recommend? Kronos for chips, cameras, sensors of other kinds in the future.
Yeah. Our tagline is connecting software to silicon, so basically hardware. Down at the hardware device level, we tend to work pretty low down in the stack.
Are there any other standards development organizations that might be relevant? There used to be in the past, but I think they've kind of moved away from mobile devices, moving more into automotive. What do you think? Pretty much Kronos is the place to be.
For that particular domain, yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. So how about systems and platform providers? Ooh, here we've got a long list. The alphabet soup that I shared before. Any comments? I think right now the systems and display providers are really struggling with how much to open their ecosystems. They have had moderate success by keeping their tools proprietary and closed, and just starting to dabble in the W3C, the WebXR. There's been, as you've noted, Neil, a lot of support by these display platform providers for OpenXR, but it's not enough because at the application layer, there isn't interoperability on the data, and it's extremely difficult to integrate with these tools that are available today. So I think if I were a platform provider, the strategy is get up to speed on these different standards because they are going to make your life easier. Any comments? We don't have very much time left. I do want to get to the last poll. Any comments so far, systems integrators, developers?
I mean, the platform standard, it depends what platform you're talking about. In some ways, the web is
AR
actually,
displays, the displays.
Yeah. In some ways, the web is actually one of the more evolved ones. WebXR is doing a reasonable job for the browser platform. The other platforms like mobile tend to be more proprietary at this point.
And the data. So we talked about the customer segment needing more support for privacy, security, and so forth. Probably the customer segment, which SDOs, just depends on the type of device and the challenges in the vertical that you're in too. If you have a high risk or some specific safety issues, perhaps in a manufacturing environment. I guess I'd like to take the last couple minutes. We can have this discussion talking about those alphabet soups, and I'd like to put this poll on just for the last few minutes. We'll talk about these strategies, gentlemen. While people are beginning to vote on this last one, asking the most compelling reason for adopting, and you can only select one, which one would it be? But what it is, isn't it? Unfortunately, it doesn't permit us to allow you to check all. But I wanted to get that ranking and understand that better this way. Scott, you didn't get a chance to say what other SDOs you see around you that are maybe important to members of the geospatial community or the AR community? What other SDOs?
Yeah, and our focus is so much more on the content side. And so it's those organizations that help enable sharing of content as well as use of content. And so we work very closely with people like W3C, not in the same field. Our work with W3C is primarily concerned with linked data concepts and the data on the web and how to users experience that deeper dive into the data that they might get to from location. But yeah, there are any number of organizations out there that are promoting sharing of content and ensuring that content can communicate with other content, and you can find that information across. So that's
the data has to work for you, not be a burden. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. About 65% of the participants answered. And very interesting that maximizing flexibility of the lifetime of current investment seems to be a very important driver. And in fact, reduced cost is embedded in several of these others. It's a red herring, perhaps. But I'm happy to see that people recognize that standards and interoperability as a strategy will help them to have more flexible strategies, be able to integrate more easily, and extend the lifetime of what they've already invested in. Any comments, gentlemen, on the results of this poll? Any surprises?
Not really surprised. I think as a lot of companies they're putting a lot of irons into the technology fire, including AR and other capabilities, and ramping up probably investments into really getting value out of their data, the Industry 4.0 initiatives, and the knowledge of that investment may not, bear fruit for a time as you continue to invest in technologies. That's what I see reflected there. Is you need to be flexible with what technologies and what solutions are going to work for your company, and there's a lot offered right now. And then you want to make that money that you put in there continue to reap benefits as you come over the curve.
Exactly.
Yep. I mean, if you invest in standards, you're already investing in a thriving cooperative ecosystem rather than just a proprietary product. So yeah, I think that red bar is good.
Yeah,
Good sign.
It's good to see that no one answered reduced costs, which means that everyone's looking to this to improve value, and that's a good perspective.
Exactly. That's fantastic. Thank you, audience. Thank you, speakers, for a very, very valuable session. We need more of these. I'm sorry we didn't have time to take audience questions. I will be sure to share with our speakers the comments that were contributed. Thank you, Bill. And with that, I'd like to close this session and wish everybody a very pleasant rest of your day. Thank you again. Goodbye.
Thanks, Christine.
Thank you, Christine.